There's a doctrine, and it's taught by many pastors in the past, but you don't hear it very often today, called the providence of God. The providence of God is God's divine guidance. It's His gracious oversight of the universe that we live in, because God is in charge. God is sovereign. If we could see with spiritual eyes, we would see that God's fingerprints are on everything that He touches. It may not be visible, but He's making things happen. Everything God creates has an assignment. It has a purpose. And God will direct it until it has fulfilled its purpose. He will direct it until whatever it was has fulfilled its assignment. Colossians 1 verse 17 says, "And He is before all things, and in Him all things consist." Hebrews 1 verse 3 says, "He upholds all things. He upholds all things by the word of His power." And who's His word? It's Jesus Christ. Proverbs 16:9 says, "A man's heart plans his way, but it is God who directs his footsteps." Nothing in life happens by chance. God directs all things, even what we're going through right now. We can find an excellent example of God's providence when we read Genesis chapters 37 through chapters 50, and we're reading about the story of Joseph. Now, the real hero in this story is not Joseph. The real hero is God. The story is not so much about Joseph. It's about God. It's about His love. It's about His goodness. It's about His kindness. It's about His sovereignty. Here's what we know about Joseph. We know that he was the favorite son of Jacob. We know that he was a dreamer. We also know that he had 10 older brothers. And they hated him. They hated him even more when his father, Jacob, gave him a coat of many colors. And he hated him even more after he had 2 dreams. He dreamed that his brothers and his mother and his father were going to bow down to him. That made his brothers angry. They were envious. Their envy turned into a conspiracy because they were trying to decide, how can we get rid of our brother Joseph? Now, Genesis 37 says they threw him into a pit. And after they threw him into a pit, they sat around a fire eating a meal, trying to decide, what are we going to do with him now? So Joseph is laying at the bottom of this pit, and he's yelling and screaming for mercy and for help. But they're just totally ignoring him. And then along comes from some Ishmaelite traders. Well, Joseph's brother Judah says, "Hey, let's not kill Joseph. Let's make some money off of Joseph." So they sold Joseph to the traders for 20 pieces of silver. That's probably a lot of money. The Bible doesn't say what happens next, but you can only imagine that Joseph was bound, he was shackled, thrown in the back of some wagon, or just dragged behind some camel or something to Egypt, where he was put up for sale. And I can also believe that his brothers were probably laughing and mocking Joseph as he was being dragged away. The brothers shredded Joseph's coat of many colors, and then they covered it with blood. And then they deceived their father Jacob. They told their father Jacob that his son, the son that he loved so much, had been killed. He was dead. Now, when Joseph got to Egypt, he was put on display in the slave market. He was put up for sale. And he was purchased by Potiphar. But by the providence of God, it was all over Joseph. And even though he was a slave purchased by Potiphar, he was trained, he was educated, and he learned how to take control and to manage the household of Potiphar, a very rich man. But as he grew older, Joseph became stronger and he became handsome. And Potiphar's wife was attracted to him. She wanted to sleep with him. So she enticed him. And she lured him into her chambers. And she tried to have sex with Joseph. But Joseph said, no, not going to do it. So she tries again, and then she tries again. And then she tries to force herself on him, but he would not submit to her sexual advances. He would not sin against his God. He's a righteous man. So Joseph continued to resist her advances. And Mrs. Potiphar grabs his cloak, pulls him to her. But Joseph wiggles and manages to get himself out of the cloak, and he runs away, which angered Mrs. Potiphar. And she tells her husband that Joseph had tried to rape her, and that angers Potiphar. He's so angry that he calls his men together. He tells them, go get Joseph and throw him into a prison. Now, this could have been the end of the story of Joseph. But God's hand was all over the life of Joseph. The providence of God was on Joseph. Joseph's position and his status was elevated even though he was in prison. While he was in prison, he became the chief trustee in prison. He was responsible and directed all the other prisoners. But he was still in prison. So he waited. And he waited. Day after day and then year after year, he kept waiting for God to do something. He had faith in his God. Now, during that time, 2 other men were thrown into the prison with him. They had angered Pharaoh. One of them was his baker, and the other one was his cupbearer. And while they were in prison, they had a dream, and they shared it with Joseph. And Joseph interpreted the dream, and he told them that one of them was going to live, and the other one was going to die. Well, 3 days later, the baker died, and the cupbearer lived. He lives. So Joseph tells the cupbearer that you're going to be getting out of the prison pretty soon. And when you do, don't forget me. Don't forget me. Well, the cupbearer gets out, but he forgets all about Joseph. And 2 years pass, and Joseph is miserable. He's still in prison, and it looks like God has forgotten all about him. But then the Pharaoh has a dream. And then he has another dream, and he wants to know what is the meaning of these dreams. So he calls together all of his wise men throughout all of Egypt to come to the palace and tell him, what do these dreams mean? Tell me, what do they mean? And none of them could figure it out. None of them could tell him. None of them could interpret what the dreams meant. And this angered Pharaoh. But at that time, at that moment, the cupbearer remembers Joseph. And he tells Pharaoh, I met a Hebrew in prison who can interpret dreams. So Pharaoh immediately summonses Joseph to come before him and interpret his dream. And they clean him up and they shave off his beard, put on some new clothes. So there's Joseph standing in front of the most powerful man in the world at that time. And Pharaoh shares his dream. Joseph tells Pharaoh that his dream foretells of 7 good years, 7 lean years, or 7 fat years, and then 7 lean years, which were all coming to Egypt. And Pharaoh was impressed. He was so impressed that he elevated Joseph to become like the prime minister of Egypt, taking care of all of his affairs. So the nation of Egypt goes through the 7 good years. Then they go through 7 fat years. And all this time, Joseph is having them take the extra grain and store it up into a storehouse, saving it for those 7 lean years. So when the lean years came, Egypt had food. But the rest of the world was in famine. They were starving. They were starving in Canaan, where Joseph's family came from. And Jacob, his father, hears that there's grain in Egypt. So he sends his son to Egypt to see if he could buy some grain. Now the brothers come to Egypt and they're standing before Joseph, but they don't know it's him, because he looks like an Egyptian and he talks like an Egyptian. He's dressed like an Egyptian, and he's a powerful man sitting on this throne in Egypt. You know, they really never knew what happened to Joseph. They didn't know if he was dead or alive. But Joseph recognizes his brothers, but he doesn't reveal himself to them. So Joseph thought, I'm going to test my brothers and see if they repented for what they have done to me. And he hides some silver in one of their bags. And he sends his brothers back to Canaan to get his brother Benjamin and bring him to Egypt. Finally, Joseph believes that his brothers have changed, so Joseph reveals who he is. Now, wouldn't you have liked to have been a fly in the palace when Joseph says, I'm your brother Joseph? The most powerful prime minister in Egypt. You know, his brothers are wondering, what is this Egyptian going to do with us? Is he going to do something to us? Is he going to sell us some grain? And then he says, I'm your brother, Joseph. Come here to me. Let me love you. I know they were scared to death. So Joseph tells him about 5 times, I love you, I love you, I love you. And then he sends his brothers back to Canaan to get their father and bring the entire family back to Egypt. And when they do, Joseph has made arrangements for the entire family to live in Goshen. And they lived there for 17 years until his father Jacob died. Now when Jacob died, the brothers believed that brothers didn't really believe that he loved him. They believed that they were being nice to them because Jacob was alive. And as long as Jacob was alive, Joseph was going to be nice to them. And they felt that now that Jacob is dead, now that our father is dead, Joseph is going to have his revenge on us. What is he going to do with us? Is he going to kill us? The entire family is here. What is he going to do with us? So in Genesis 50, it says the brothers conspire again against Joseph. And they lie to him. This is a group of lying. You know, we've got 12 tribes, and there are a group of liars at the head of our tribes that make up our nation of Israel. They tell him that their father Jacob had told him while he was alive that should he die, to make sure that you tell Joseph to be nice to his brothers. Well, hearing this, Joseph wept because he realized just how deep their guilt was about what they had done and how remorseful they were. And they feared that he didn't love them. Even after 17 years of taking care of his brothers and taking care of his family, it seemed that they didn't realize how much he loved them. They didn't understand that everything that had happened, God had orchestrated it to happen. God had made it happen. Because God had made it into good. What the brothers had meant for evil, God made it to be good.
Amen.
It was meant for good. Because Joseph had gotten to know God. Joseph had gotten to know God while he was a slave. Joseph had gotten to know God while he was in prison. Joseph had gotten to know God in the good years. He got to know God in the fat years. He got to know God in the lean years. He saw that the hand of God was on everything. Joseph understood the providence of God. Everything had to happen just as God had planned it. Just as God had planned it, so that everything would happen at just the right moment. Rightly? At just the right moment. Jacob gave Joseph the coat of many colors. At just the right moment, Joseph would have his dreams. At just the right moment, the brothers would get angry. At just the right moment, they would throw him into a pit. At just the right moment, the Ishmaelites would come along, and at just the right moment, they would sell him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. At just the right moment, he would become a slave. At just the right moment, he'd be taken to Egypt. At just the right moment, he would be bought as a slave in the market in Egypt. At just the right moment, he was purchased by Potiphar. At just the right moment, he became the head of the household of Potiphar. At just the right moment, Mrs. Potiphar would notice that he is strong and very handsome. At just the right moment, she would try to seduce him. And at just the right moment, he'd say no. And at just the right moment, she'd try to seduce him again. And in the right moment, he'd say no again. And at just the right moment, she would grab his cloak. And at just the right moment, he'd wiggle out of it and he would run away. And at just the right moment, she'd accuse him of rape. And at just the right moment, he'd be thrown into prison. Well, at just the right moment, the baker and the cupbearer, they come into his life. And at just the right moment, they have a dream. And at just the right moment, he interprets the dream. And at just the right moment, the baker dies and the cupbearer lives. Well, at just the right moment, the cupbearer would forget all about Joseph. And then 2 years would go by. And at just the right moment, Pharaoh would have a dream. At just the right moment, nobody would be able to interpret it. Well, at just the right moment, the cupbearer would remember Joseph. And at just the right moment, they would bring Joseph in front of Pharaoh. And at just the right moment, Joseph hears Pharaoh's dream. And at just the right moment, he interprets Pharaoh's dream. And at just the right moment, he's elevated to become prime minister of Egypt. At just the right moment, there are 7 good years. At just the right moment, there are 7 fat years. At just the right moment, there are 7 lean years. And at just the right moment, the famine reaches Canaan. At just the right moment, Joseph sends for his family. Jacob sends his brothers to Canaan. They meet Joseph at just the right moment. They don't know who he is at just the right moment. Joseph puts them to the test at just the right moment. At just the right moment, they don't go get their father. At just the right moment, they bring their father and the family to Egypt. And at just the right moment, Joseph ends up exactly where God intended him to be. There's a chain of circumstances. There's a chain of circumstances in the providence of God, and every little step must be taken along the way. But there's still another part to the story that I haven't shared with you yet. Another little step that needed to be taken. If you've read the story in Genesis chapter 37, at the beginning of the story, Jacob sends his sons out to watch their flocks, and he sends his sons out to Shechem to watch the flock, because that's where they were supposed to be. But they weren't there. And he sends Joseph to go talk to his sons. But like I said, they were not in Shechem when Joseph got there. They were not where they were supposed to be. So Joseph is out in the wilderness and he's just walking around. And in the middle of nowhere, here comes this stranger. And he sees Joseph and he asks Joseph, "What are you doing? What are you looking for?" And Joseph says, "I'm looking for my brothers. They're tending to our flock." And this stranger says, "I know where they are. They're not here. They're in Dothan." So Joseph heads to Dothan. Okay, so who is this guy? Where did he come from? He suddenly drops into our story, and just as quickly he suddenly drops out of the story. Could he have been an angel of the Lord? Is this part of God's providence? He planted an angel there to put Joseph where he needed to be? Well, I don't know. The Bible doesn't say. But what is important is that this tiny little link in this chain of events had to happen. God had to make sure that this happened at just the right moment so that the rest of the story could take place. Without that one little link in the story, everything else that I shared with you that took place at just the right moment would never have taken place at that moment. So here's a question. How much of this story about Joseph did Joseph know in advance? When Joseph went out to look for his brothers, did he know that they were in Dothan? No, he didn't know they were there. When Joseph was thrown into the pit, how much did he know in advance what was going to happen? He didn't know anything. When Joseph was purchased by Potiphar, how much did he know in advance of what was going to happen? He didn't know anything. When Joseph was thrown into prison, how much did he know in advance? Nothing. When Joseph met the baker and the cupbearer, how much did he know was going to happen in advance? Nothing. When the cupbearer forgot him, how much did Joseph know in advance what was going to happen with his life? He knew nothing. It's not until Joseph gets to the very end of the story did Joseph know anything of what was going on. And now looking back, he's able to see what happened and why it happened. He says, "I finally see it." He's talking to his brothers. "Don't you see it? You know what you meant for evil, God meant for good." Everything became clear. Was it clear while he was going through it? No.
He did have that prophetic dream when he was young, though.
Oh yeah.
He had a glimpse of it.
Yeah,
Just kind of hold on to
he
what was
talked
going
about
on.
everybody bowing down, but he didn't know what it meant. So we're living in some pretty wicked times right now. Well, how much do we know in advance? Things are not any clearer now than they were a year ago. We're continuing to walk and we're continuing to take this journey without really knowing what's going to happen. We're being deceived or being lied to. Kind of sounds like Joseph's brothers. But one day, we'll be able to look back and we're going to be able to say, "Now I understand." what we are living through, it's all about the providence of God. It's all about God's divine guidance. Now you may be wondering, what about our free will? What about our ability to choose our fate? How can God have complete providence and divine direction if we've got free will to decide what we're going to do? Well, look around you right now. Look around what's going on in the world right now. That's part of the problem that we're facing right now. They want to force you out of fear to live like them, to act like them, to talk like them, to think like them. They're trying to take away your free will. They're trying to program you to do what they want you to do. They're trying to take away your free will. But God gives us free will. He doesn't force us to do anything. It's our choice. And whatever we decide to do, we've got to suffer the consequences, whether they're good or whether they're bad. It was our choice. Now we're either going to be blessed or we're going to be cursed because of what we've done. So where are you putting your faith? Are you putting your faith in man or are you putting your faith in God? The Bible says we have free will. But at the same time, the Bible says that God directs our footsteps. How can you have both at the same time? How can God do both of these things, give us free will, but direct our footsteps? I don't know. That's God. That's God's providence. There's a lot of stuff in the Bible that God does that I don't understand. I don't know how he's able to do it. I just trust God and I have faith in God. So let's look back at the story of Joseph again. At no point along the way did anyone forced to do anything. Everybody did exactly what they wanted to do. When the brothers got angry, they did what they wanted to do. They threw Joseph into a pit. When the traders came along, they did what they wanted to do. They purchased Joseph and made him a slave, and they dragged him away to Egypt. Now, when in Egypt, Potiphar did what he wanted to do. He bought Joseph to be his slave. And Mrs. Potiphar, well, she tried to do what she wanted to do. When Joseph stood before Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world, Pharaoh did what he wanted to do. And somehow, in some way that only God can explain, God takes the free actions of his people, acting on their own, and he mixes it all together. And in the end, Joseph is exactly where God wanted him to be. And everyone had free will. No one was forced to do anything. I can't explain it. That's the providence of God. Just like Joseph, we need to keep our faith in God. We've got to put our lives in his hands. We've got to trust him. We've got to trust him while we're waiting on things to happen. We don't know the future. God does. And God is working on that future. And God doesn't make mistakes. So I don't know what's going to happen next. But I trust in God's providence. I don't know what's going to happen to the River Room Church as we step into our 11th year of ministry. Only God does. But whatever it is, whatever is awaiting for us, I know that God means it for good. So I obey, and I look forward to the journey, and I hope you do too.